Hey everyone, Voice of Reason 467 here. I wanted to do a little bit of a vlog on not just my view on Star Wars, specifically the Disney era and why exactly it is I'm not a fan of the whole thing. I guess they've been going on about this for about 10 years now, but more or less to explain where it is I'm coming from the perspective of an old fan. Now, you see a lot of these videos, I would imagine, of people just grifting and raging about Disney and how badly they've been doing. I would like to go and point out here that while I'm not a fan of the things that they've done with the franchise thus far, they haven't done exactly that bad when it comes to certain types of properties. The Mandalorian is pretty good, at least for the first two seasons. The Acolyte, as panned as it was, and obviously critically so, there's a lot of grifting and a lot of obvious forced hate on the subject, which I think is completely unwarranted in many regards. Yes, there are problems with the show, but for the most part, it is an adequate show for what they did. Unfortunately, it got canceled. Andor is pretty much stellar in terms of the actual material therein. Um, so there are things to actually engage with. I have heard that characters like Dr. Aphra are written fairly good, although to be perfectly honest, I couldn't get past the first few issues of her comic that was starting her story, primarily due to the simple fact that there were some really cringe moments. I mean, she basically tries to say, "Look, is that another Death Star?" And then they look, and you would expect it to just start running, but she just stands there. Like, was that meant to be a joke? The joke is, look, another thing there. And then they look, and then they look back, and she's gone. That's the joke. That's the punchline of that thing. It doesn't work if she just stands there. And there are a couple of other cringe moments throughout the entirety of the beginning of the comics, of the introduction of her character, that really did not sell me well. Perhaps she gets better as time goes by, but I've heard she's fairly well written. That being said here, I think it's important to understand where it is I'm coming from in terms of my perspective. Now, for the record, I'm 38. All right, I remember watching Star Wars back when I was 7, 8 years old. When I got a hold of the VHS tapes of my parents in terms of the Star Wars trilogy, and were able to watch them. This was before, of course, special editions came out, and were being advertised as being the true vision of George Lucas at the time. There was an effort, of course, to sell off the old versions that were going to basically replace the old that were basically going to replace the old ones with new special effects and the puppetry therein. However, even though I saw both versions growing up, I didn't really have this huge visceral reaction to that a lot of old trilogy fanatics or old sorry, not old trilogy, original trilogy fanatics or original trilogy only fans, as they like to call themselves, when in fact they're just fanatics. Um, I didn't really get upset about that, primarily because I hadn't spent about 20 some odd years after seeing the original trilogy growing up in the theaters, seeing it for the first time, and then having this sort of notion of how things are supposed to be, and how things are meant to be interpreted outside the intention of the creator, and then getting upset that that because the creator doesn't agree with me, you know he doesn't agree with my take and whatnot, and he does very minuscule minor additions here and there. I didn't have that experience. That and I was a little kid. There was nothing really for me to be upset about. My whole attitude at the time was, wow, special editions, new Star Wars stuff, um, in terms of special effects and CGI, replacing the puppetry. Wow, that sounds awesome. That was my perspective as a little kid, of course, growing up. And then I saw the prequel trilogies um, as they came out. Now, during the time I was around 14, 15 years old. Actually, no, I was around 14 years old when The Phantom Menace came out. And I liked it as a kid, growing up, watching it for the first time. I even bought the visual dictionary for the for the movie. It was being advertised and being sold not only in the theater but also in the local bookstore in the mall where the movie was actually being shown. So, with that being said here, the whole prequel trilogy sort of dropped off for me, you know, uh, during Attack of the Clones, and then picked back up during Revenge of the Sith. The reason why, of course, with Attack of the Clones, the movie was much more slower paced, and as a result, there was far too much dialogue and not enough action for my particular taste growing up. Because, to be perfectly honest, in between the release of The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, I had a slew of video games to go through. I played the original Phantom Menace on the PS1. That was a blast. I ended up playing not the bounty, not the later on after the PS2 released, I ended up getting Star Wars Bounty Hunter, which was fucking fantastic. It was absolutely amazing for me to be able to experience that, especially playing as Jango Fett. It gave me such an insight into his character and how he was going to be portrayed in the movies later on. And also gave me an idea for, well, what was going to go down, if you would. The creation of the Clone Army. I kind of got that hint from that game before I saw the movie. For the record, I don't remember if the game actually released before the movie of Attack of the Clones, but I remember playing the game and then watching the movie. So that being said here, I don't think you should take my particular recollections of the events of my experience as like the release order of the game. For all I know, for all I can recall, the movie came in before the actual release of Star Wars Bounty Hunter. So yeah. And, during that time, of course, there were a lot of other releases. There were comics, there were books that I was reading. I had read the Thrawn trilogy beforehand, so I'd even read a number of things like the Jedi Academy series as well. Jedi Academy was also a game that I had played during that time as well. It was fucking beyond amazing. Star Wars Dark Forces. There was the what was it called? The Rogue Squadron series of Star Wars. So I was really big into the whole video game, comic, and book stuff growing up as a kid before I saw Attack of the Clones. And there was a lot of action in there, but also a lot of character development in it as well. But I was mostly attracted to the action because I was really big into video games at the time. So when Attack of the Clones released, I didn't really like it. I thought it was pretty boring. And for the most part, a lot of the fights didn't really hit it for me, except for the Yoda fight at the end, which I later heard, of course, that a lot of people viewed as sacrilege, as ruining Yoda's character, which, like, I don't understand that, really, honestly. It's just utter nonsense to me, anyways. But the fact of the matter is that my particular viewpoint, later on, I grew to actually like the series for the most part. And I didn't really get the criticisms that people kept saying about the romance of Attack of the Clones, because in my mind, during the watching of that, and during subsequent rewatchings, of course, I'd come to the obvious conclusion that, for the most part, this was an attempt by two people who are, for all intents and purposes, romantically illiterate, that being Anakin and Padme, falling in love and trying to express romantic interest for the very first time on a genuine effort. Anakin, having the crush that he did, and having grown up in the Jedi Order, that being the fact that he's supposed to be a celibate monk who's not supposed to fall in love with anyone, and not supposed to feel strong emotional attachments to certain people, or to anyone, in fact, obviously met his childhood crush again, his effort to actually have some form of feeling of admiration, as during childhood had boiled up to his teenage years. And Padme, having seen this kid when she was 14 years old, had grown up to become a senator and had a life that more or less basically mirrored the whole I'm so important, yet I'm so hated by certain types of people, I can't even have have a normal relationship with anyone because they might try to backstab me, you know. And at least that's the sense I got from the fact that she was using a double when she was a queen, and she continued using double, uh, that double in Attack of the Clones at the very beginning when she gets killed effectively. So I think it's important to more or less understand that she didn't really have any kind of experience during romantic interest. So when people say that the romance seems stilted and jarring and it seems unnatural in many ways, that's because you're watching two people who are effectively romantically illiterate express romantic interest in one another. It's going to be that way. And I thought that was fairly well played out. But at any rate, from then on, of course, more video games, more comics, stuff like that. I got into things like Knights of the Republic, both 1 and 2. I got into, what was it called? Star Wars Commando. That was fantastic beyond anything else. And then the release of Revenge of the Sith came out, and it just blew me out of the water. Absolutely fantastic. Not only action-packed throughout most of it, but also very suspenseful and very thrilling in many regards. I kind of knew that Palpatine was the Emperor to begin with. We all knew that kind of going in. If you've seen the original trilogy, it was sort of to explain how he got into the position that he did and where exactly it was that he was going with it to create the Empire. Or not where, how exactly it was that he was going to create the Empire. As well as the death of the Jedi, as an explanation, if you would. So we already kind of knew what things was going in there. Now, later on, of course, the Clone Wars cartoon kind of came out, and I watched it, obviously, because I was a huge fan at the time. And during its airing, I noticed that there was a lot of, back and forth and things, that the whole thing was aired out of sequence, that certain events were being referenced I hadn't seen, that later on I'd actually been able to see. And well, to be perfectly honest, it didn't really drive well for me as a viewing experience. I did enjoy each episode, but in and of itself, but as a sequence of events during its airing, I didn't really like it. Now, of course, I was able to later on experience it in chronological order, and I found it to be absolutely fantastic, and I loved a lot of what was being put forth there in terms of the relationship with the clones and everything else, the political themes that sort of hinted at, the foreshadowing with those little lemur type aliens, which at the very end of that episode he looks up and he sees the ships of the Republic clone army coming in at the sky, and he asks, like, what will it cost us to be involved in your war? Very, very ominous foreshadowing, but at the time it's viewed as, symbolically, or it's portrayed as symbolically a victory, when in fact it's very ominous if you know what's going to happen. So, but with that being said here, I'd experienced a lot of the Clone Wars multimedia project, the video games, the comics, the books, and not so much the books, of course, but mainly the comics and the video games. But I noticed that a lot of material and a lot of stuff had been changed from time to time. Certain stories were never picked up, certain presentation of events were never brought forward. Which more or less indicated to me that this is just a fun little introduction to get people excited to actually view the actual canon of events. Which at the time I didn't know that this was meant to replace the multimedia project of 2003 that was kicked off during Attack of the Clones. So, in all honesty, I come from a very long history of knowing and understanding how Star Wars is, and sort of imbibing in its lore, in the stories, in the messages, and everything else that's going on there. Which is why, to be perfectly honest, I'm not a huge fan of Disney's iteration of it. And let me go and explain why. The first reason why it is I'm not a fan of what they've been doing is that, and this is obviously is a huge elephant in the room, is that they decanonize the entirety of Star Wars canon, all the way back to the Old Republic, which was what I was a really huge fan of once the Clone Wars had sort of died down as cartoons, and once Revenge of the Sith had ended, the Old Republic was in full swing. And I was really, really into that, of course. The MMO was fantastic, if you ask me. It was one of the more interesting iterations of an MMO. And Star Wars wasn't exactly what people were calling it at the time, a WoW killer, that being World of Warcraft. But it was unique enough that after it, I couldn't really get into any other MMOs due to the simple fact that a lot of the story and a lot of the quests were presented in a fairly cinematic perspective, and that breathed life into the MMO that made me feel like I was actually in a world rather than just playing a game like most MMOs were. But the fact that they decanonized all of that really, really, really pissed me off, because there were certain storylines I was hoping to continue, or I was, hoping that they would continue, in an effort to basically fill in the gaps and then lead in with their own story. In fact, the saga, as you would imagine, could have continued far beyond Luke, Han, and Leia. But, the reasoning for that, of course, and the reason why that stings for me is because they gave two answers, which one of it was a lie, and the other one shows their two-faced nature of it. The first one, which is a lie, that they wanted to wipe the slate clean and make it so that way the original trilogy, the prequels, and the Clone Wars saga, which George Lucas was directly involved in, would remain canon, and this would allow them to effectively be able to have more creative control and be able to have more creative freedom over how to portray this Star Wars universe more directly. And they would attempt to create a synergy between all the various different video games, comics, and books going forward that they claimed at the time hadn't been up to muster, which I will admit there were a few retcons here and there. I'm not going to deny that, of course. The Clone Wars saga, the Clone Wars cartoon being the biggest one, obviously, had a bunch of retcons, and in many ways even had a bunch of, and in many ways like undid certain stories, decanonized a lot of things in the Clone Wars saga, and even portrayed certain characters like Quinlan Vos very poorly, if you ask me. So, with that being said here, there wasn't really a huge roaring fit by fans to decanonize the Clone Wars cartoon, because it could mostly be ignored. Most of the material had already been written, most of the stuff had already been put forth in the comics and the books and whatnot, and the era had been well fleshed out enough that most people didn't really have to bother, with the Clone Wars cartoon. You were either a fan of the Clone Wars cartoon, or you were a fan of the multimedia project, or you were like me, you were a fan of both. But you viewed one as canon over the other, obviously. And that was, for the most part, just how it was. But that was effectively the lie in saying that, oh, we want to make it so that way this effort of contradicting canon isn't a problem anymore. I'll explain why that was also a lie in the second part, of course, later on. But the reason why it is a lie is because they gave a second explanation. And this came from Leland Chi, obviously, is that he had talked to people like Bob Iger and various different higher-ups at Disney who wanted to create an original trilogy and realized that Chewbacca had been dead and killed, and they couldn't use him in an original trilogy as a result. So they thought that instead of incorporating his story into the beginning of a new saga and continuing therein with an adaptation of the Long trilogy, that they would just decanonize it all so that way Chewie could be alive. This, to me, shows that Disney is utterly and completely two-faced when it comes to handling Star Wars. And the reason why I say this, for the record, is because they didn't have to do this. They could have done exactly what it is I said there, having Chewie in the original in the sequel trilogy, you know, by portraying the Vong, or by doing a lead up to his death throughout the trilogy. So, but they would have to adapt quite a bit there. The other thing, of course, the reason why it is I find this to be completely two-faced is that they have been attempting to scrub the internet of this information, of people who actually paid attention to it and know about it and would bring this stuff up, like myself. There is info about where it comes from, but the original source of where it was said is no longer there. There's a site somewhere, I don't exactly remember where it was, I'll probably put it down below in the description section, but suffice to say, they say where the original source was, and if you go to the actual site, you try to look it up, it's not there anymore, it's been scrubbed. Which indicates to me that Disney doesn't want people to know about this stuff. They don't want to know about the two-faced nature. And not only that, and this is a big one for me, is that it shows that Disney doesn't fundamentally understand Star Wars. They think that Star Wars is built off the brand recognition of Chewbacca, Han Solo, Leia, Luke, C-3PO, Ben Kenobi, and Anakin Skywalker, as well as Darth Vader. But what they don't realize, of course, is that all of that, and I mean all of that, is completely superfluous to the fact that they were in a story that spanned multiple generations within said story and told a cohesive plot, told a cohesive message, and told multiple different references in and of itself in order to sell you Star Wars. And ultimately speaking, at the very base of it, that's why it is I don't like Disney Star Wars. Because I don't believe that Disney fundamentally even understands what they've got for themselves. I think they view Star Wars not as this synergistic, symmetrical bit of storytelling that allows people to create mythologies of the modern era that more or less connect with people because they attempt to write the stories as if the people there are real rather than just imagined characters going along a plot line. They don't understand that that's what Star Wars is. And instead they think that Star Wars is simply just a money-making factory, which, on the side note, it kind of is, with the advertisement and the name recognition that it has there. But ever since they've gotten it over the past 10 years, Disney has really, really run this franchise into the fucking ground. I mean, it is genuinely impressive, if it wasn't so sad, about how much Star Wars used to be so beloved and so iconic to so many sci-fi fans, to now basically being this thing that people acknowledge in the room but don't really want to imbibe in all that much because it has a certain reputation for it, not only because of its fans, who, I'll be perfectly honest, a lot of the people who call themselves Star Wars fans are just grifters. They're not Star Wars fans at all. They make their money simply by hating on any and everything that's new, that's coming out from Star Wars, regardless if it is of any particular amount of quality, which is kind of infuriating to me. But then again, that's been kind of the case with the original trilogy fanatics as well. So, you could say, of course, that this isn't exactly Disney's fault, that this goes all the way back to George Lucas and the reaction he got from the prequels, and I would agree. But point being, Disney hasn't been living up to that hype. The other thing the other reason why it is, and I'm sorry that took so long to explain here, because that's the base of it. The other thing I don't like about Disney Star Wars is the fact that they don't seem to actually understand that they have to make a plan and commit to that plan in fleshing out the era that they're putting forth out there. They put out as much material as they can and as they have about the Clone Wars saga, but a lot of that stuff has already been fleshed out by George Lucas. So there's really no point in doing so. Then there is, of course, the sequel trilogy era. They still haven't fleshed out all the details about what's going on with the with everything that's with everything that happened with the First Order, with how Snoke came to being, about how it is that Palpatine survived in the first place. What ways in which did he survive exactly? I mean, people are saying, "Oh, it's cloning or whatever. It's a Palpatine clone, right?" Well, we don't know that. For all we know is that they were built. Is that this was an effort to explain how it is that Snoke came to be. You know, in the Mandalorian, I guess third season. Yeah, which by the way is probably the worst season out of the entire bunch because, well, it not only foreshadows the sequel trilogy in an unnecessary fashion, it completely makes a mockery of it in the sense that they had like Imperials trying to gain force powers and force abilities through cloning, which like that was already tackled in The Force Awakens 2 by showcasing that you can't really clone Jedi or people with force abilities because they will always end up as imperfect creations. So yeah, I wish we did get an answer, by the way, as to how it is that Starkiller was, whether or not he was actually a clone or not. I wish we'd gotten an answer to that. In my mind, he's not a clone. He's obviously the original who had been reconstructed and remade and healed up and whatnot, and had lost all of his memory because of the battle and because he had died, effectively, which honestly makes a lot more sense to me. So, yeah, and they aren't committing to this plan at all. They're going all over the place, really. They have the High Republic, which is an era that nobody really gives a shit about. I mean, the fans of the High Republic that actually do exist are more or less in a state of this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. But there's really no exploration of how this is affecting the overall wider period of the galaxy and how this leads into events moving forward with the prequel trilogy. Because, obviously the High Republic is a lead up to the prequel trilogy of events. But how does it lead up to that? How does it connect to that? Nobody knows. Nobody cares. Nobody's doing anything about that. Which makes me wonder, what do they have exactly? I mean, they had the Drengir, which was probably the only interesting thing about the High Republic whatsoever. But they got rid of that and sealed it off. And by the way, they made it a completely flaccid, a completely and utterly flaccid threat, simply by the fact that they set the High Republic to 300 years or something like that before the prequel trilogy, which means effectively that any threat that the Drengir have are not really informed whatsoever by the greater context of George Lucas's prequel trilogy, which indicates to me that they didn't really amount to much. They didn't really do anything. If they had set the High Republic like 2,000 years or 2,500 years, there could have been some real teeth to that. But they didn't, Then they have these pirates that are basically act as Team Rocket for Star Wars. They do something evil, and at first they were presented as, oh, they're this group of pirates and outlaws that have established themselves in a certain part of the galaxy that the Republic hasn't exactly been able to establish itself, and it's encroaching on their borders. So maybe the Republic are the bad guys in this situation. Nope, nope. The fucking the pirates, whatever the fuck they're called, I forget what their names are. They're just bad guys. They're just flat out bad guys. They apparently virus bomb planets. They take up slaves and whatnot. They engage in all kinds of kidnappings and machinations. They bombard planets. It's like, but they get thwarted at every single turn, and it's like, oh, and the first phase ends, and the second phase begins with a peace celebration, indicating to me that they aren't really doing anything of any particular consequence. No consequence is actually being had, so nothing in the High Republic really matters. And they advertised it like it would matter, but it didn't, So that's like, they don't commit is what my point is. My point is that when they make an announcement to put forth new material that has an impact on the Star Wars universe or has some teeth to it, they don't commit to that whatsoever, which is a huge, huge problem. It's just, like, what? And then, of course, there is the lore council, story council, whatever position of writers are meant to like comb through all the information of stories to make sure that they don't contradict each other and they don't synergize with one another. That completely fell through. Multitude of reasons, because there are multiple parts of the franchise, both in the High Republic as well as in the prequel era, and in the original trilogy era, and the sequel trilogy era as well. It all doesn't fit together. There's a lot of contradictions in there, And it's like, why would you set this group up if you were trying not to create contradictions in the lore? You have more contradictions in the lore right now that was present in the original that was present in the original George Lucas era. I mean, you have more retcons, you have more contradictions, you have more decanonizations that happened to the degree that they have happened than in the original George Lucas era. It's like, what are you doing, Disney? Do you not have any commitment at all? Obviously not. It just shows that despite owning Marvel, despite doing massively successful with that franchise, that they don't really know how to run something like Star Wars. Because unlike Marvel, which has its own comic continuity, has its own cinematic continuity, and has its own, animation network system that does its own thing to a large extent. Like, these three things don't tend to intersect all that much unless you want to go into multiversal storylines, which, unless the multiversal storylines are being done in the comics, and they stay there. And, writers and artists, they work together, and they collaborate, and they talk with one another. But in Star Wars, it seems like they're not really doing that at all. So, I don't know. It just seems like an unfruitful effort upon Disney's part. So yeah, that's my reason why it is I don't like the Disney era of Star Wars. So yeah, there are a lot of things in general I do like about the franchise, and I try to imbibe on that more so than the negativity of what Disney is doing wrong. I even try to find things that Disney is doing right and celebrate that, and in many ways admit to that. Like, a lot of people hate The Acolyte. I like The Acolyte. I think it was an alright film. Maybe not film, television series. Streaming series? Yeah, streaming series. I thought it was an alright streaming series. So, but everyone hates it. And I do believe that everyone hates it, primarily because it was an obviously concerted effort to make everyone hate it. Even Shadiversity, when he was doing his whole effort to knock on the fight scenes in that show, it was very clear that he was forcing a lot of his hatred and forcing a lot of his critiques, and just not understanding how Jedi actually fight in that regard. I mean, and the effort to reach out to him that I made in that was just met with atrocious, oh, you're just a Disney fan, you just like Disney Star Wars, you just like slop. There was no effort to communicate whatsoever. Just an effort to hate. So it's I don't think Disney is doing well with this franchise. It may pick up again in another 10 years, but thus far, I'm just having the time of my life going through all the backlog of the stuff that I missed, as well as re-experience all the material that I got back again. That I experienced back then. So yeah, it's I'm going to be playing Star Wars Bounty Hunter at some point in time. I'm probably going to see if I can go ahead and purchase Star Wars Dark Forces again, go through some of the multimedia stuff on that. I'm going to read through the Thrawn trilogy again once I get the books. I of course lost them, as you might imagine, but it is what it is, and it allows me to get the updated covers. Which, by the way, this is something I will throw Disney a bone on. This is something I do like about them, is that they're actually giving Legends books new cover art, which is absolutely fucking fantastic. So yeah, don't like Disney Star Wars. I prefer Legends. I'm an old fan, and Disney doesn't seem to know what the fuck it's doing with the series. That's the point. So yeah, see you guys later.